How's it going, guys, and welcome back to my ultimate Amara guide. And in this part we're going to be going over Amara's green and purple skill trees, both of which do focus mostly on melee damage, however do also provide a lot of general utility, survivability, and a hell of a lot of mayhem scaling shenanigans, which can be used in plenty of different ways. So let's get on into them. So coming to green tree and starting with our action skills, we first have Phase Slam, where Amara will leap up into the air and slam down, dealing damage to all nearby enemies and knocking them up. This is a very simple skill, pretty much just playing an animation and then dealing a bunch of damage surrounding you. However, if you're holding one of your directional keys while using this, you can guide it as a leap into a direction. Next is Fracture, having a higher base damage than Phase Slam and a lower cooldown, and summoning a bunch of fists that shoot up from the ground in a line in front of her, dealing damage to all enemies hit, while leaving a damaging puddle along its path of Amara's attuned element. While this isn't really a slam skill, it does still activate Phase Slam anointments. And finally, Downfall, which is similar to Phase Slam, however the slam damage itself has the lowest damage out of all of her green tree action skills, but before she slams back down into the ground, she is able to control her movement while firing down a laser beam, dealing constant damage before ending with Amara slamming back down. This has the longest cooldown at 47 seconds. It's also worth noting that all three of these skills do also deal splash damage, along with, of course, action skill and elemental damage. The element of this tree is corrosive damage, and the first augment is Revelation, lowering the base damage of her action skill, but creating a nova of her attuned element to any enemy hit by her action skill. This nova dealing splash, elemental, and skill damage. And the final augment being Glamour, which lowers the base damage of her action skill by 10%, increases the action skill cooldown by 20%, but will confuse enemies damaged by her action skill, and will attack other enemies nearby. If Amara is using Phase Grasp, all of the enemies around the grasp target will be confused. Coming to her actual skills though, in tier 1 we have Root to Rise, which is just a simple % health boost. However, do keep in mind that this can be a lot more than just a health boost, as within this tree specifically is a few sources of % health regen and damage reduction, both of which gain increased effectiveness the more HP that you actually have. For example, say you have 100 HP with 10% max health regen per second, that's 10 HP per second. But if you have 200 HP, that increases to 20 HP per second. This is situationally taken and is often just a place to dump points into, but can be more desirable over other options if you have a lot of health regen and want further survivability. Now, Personal Space is a really good skill for only 3 points, offering up to 54% bonus damage based on how close you are to an enemy. However, this damage is V2 damage, and since it's V2 damage, this means that it only works with gun damage. However, up to 54% bonus gun damage in a tier 1 skill for just 3 points is incredibly good, and even more so because you really don't have to be all that close to an enemy for this to begin to activate. As seen here, this is the distance at which it actually begins to do something, meaning that this will pretty much be almost always active in just about any engagement that you find yourself in, but just becomes even more effective at closer ranges. However, this is just a very solid and very cheap and incredibly easy to access multiplicative damage boost. Now, Clarity is just health regen, however can be very strong health regen, especially since this card isn't accurate. As it says, it provides up to 5% health regen at max rank based on your missing HP, and this doubles after using an action skill, which just means it actually is providing another stack because this works on a stacking system. Granted, this is only 5 seconds, so it's very difficult to get very many stacks on this, but if you're using a build that runs Avatar, you can actually pretty easily maintain a solid 3 stacks of this for up to 15% health regen per second. This stacking is unlimited, however, since it only lasts 5 seconds, it's incredibly difficult to abuse it beyond that point. Clarity is definitely a very solid skill for moving down the tree, though usually if I take Personal Space, I'll only throw 2 points into here, otherwise I'll max it. But pretty much all 3 of the tier 1 skills in this tree are very good options and just depend on what you actually need for your specific build. Arms Deal is just a solid splash damage bonus, offering up to 20% splash damage for absolutely free and 40% splash damage reduction, and this is definitely very worth grabbing if you can, as just not only do a lot of very strong guns deal splash damage, but a lot of Amara's skills and a couple action skills scale off of splash damage, making this still a very good and very multi-purpose pickup. The damage resistance is also there, and while somewhat nice, it isn't really the important part though, and is generally just a pretty shit stat overall, so that part of this doesn't matter too much. Samsara is probably one of my favorite Amara skills, offering both gun damage and % missing health regen that stacks with however many enemies you hit with your action skill. It is worth noting though that while Amara does have multiple other sources of skill damage, this has to be skill damage that is is actually done through your action still. Now, not only is this just up to 25% gun damage, which is very nice, but this is also up to 25% health regen per second for 20 seconds. That means in those 20 seconds, you can heal 5 full health bars. Granted, assuming you hit at least 5 enemies with your action still. And that can be fucking insane, and especially when combined with clarity, makes you incredibly tanky even at lower health, which that health regen alone makes this worth taking even for melee builds, as while you aren't getting anything out of that gun damage, for just 3 points to get that crazy health regen, this can be a fucking game changer. Now, Helping Hands is just raw damage resistance, which again is a pretty useless stat generally. It just doesn't at all scale well into the endgame, and there's way better places to put points here. However, because the arms do look really fucking cool, throwing 1 point in here for purely aesthetic purposes is definitely an option. Mindfulness provides stacking movement speed and shield regen delay, gaining stacks after Amara takes damage. This is a very strong skill that can provide up to a 25% movement speed boost, and questionably also provides decreased shield recharge delay, which is definitely odd since this still stacks on taking damage, so really that part only matters after the fight is already over, so the movement speed is definitely the main part of the skill, and is an incredibly good stat for both melee and gun builds, since for melee it allows you to move between targets quickly, and for gun builds it allows you to move between cover. Movement speed is often a very overlooked stat, but without a doubt it is added survivability. Find Your Center for a single point provides 100% melee damage and 75% melee range for 20 seconds after Amara uses her action still. For a single point, getting 100% melee damage is definitely pretty fucking crazy, and that increased melee range allows you to have a larger range to play around, which can be especially useful in Fight for Your Life while also just being a really good damage increase. This is definitely a skill that you are always going to want for any build focused around melee damage. Now, Vigor provides you 10% stacking movement speed on kill for the entire team, meaning Amara herself and anyone else that you are playing with. This is unlimited stacking, which means you can actually get a pretty decent amount of movement speed out of this, but while it's not really a bad skill, really mindfulness is just all the movement speed that you're gonna need, but this could definitely have its place if you're playing with other people and you all want to go fast. Generally though, I'm just not a huge fan of the skill, and I usually rather put the points elsewhere. One with Nature is another max health boost, but the power budget here is also split between max health and elemental damage resistance, which again, damage resistance is kinda not a great stat, and because that health is sharing the spotlight with that damage resistance, it is just less health than Root to Rise. If you need to dump points somewhere and have no other option, then sure, but it's positioned within the tree in a really awkward place, and you're pretty much guaranteed to have better options to move further down. Do Unto Others is an alright skill, it's just not really ever worth that single point. It gets splash damage boosts and it gets Mayhem scaling, and it will do somewhat decent damage, but that decent damage happens once max every 8 seconds, and I honestly find it just not to be that impactful against anything that isn't just a super squishy enemy. I just think that the 1 point here is better spent literally anywhere else. Jab Cross is probably where a majority of your points down here will go, as it's incredibly strong for builds that shoot melee damage, as it provides both gun damage and skill damage after dealing melee damage, and while that gun damage is kind of wasted for true melee builds, it is still really your best bet, as getting 75% action skill damage is incredibly nice, especially for Phase Flare. Guardian Angel pretty much just provides you a second wind for free, restoring your health and creating a Elemental Nova dealing action skill damage that can knock back nearby enemies. This skill has a 2-minute cooldown, however the max health restore is actually kinda nice, because while you may think that, well, one of the first skills that you get in the Guardian rank tree is Resilient, this is actually usually disabled on a lot of melee builds because a lot of melee builds use Roid shields, so you don't want your shield to come back. But that also means you're not recovering with the full HP from Resilient either, so getting that HP from Guardian Angel can be nice. It'll also help you deal with Fight for Your Life without having to swap to a Blade Fury or Face Puncher. If I am going to take GA, I'll usually take 1 point out of Jab Cross and put it here instead. However, Guardian Angel really isn't necessary and is more of a luxury option, but is definitely a pretty solid skill. And finally, to our capstone of the green tree is Blitz, which really should be taken for almost any melee build if you've invested enough points into the green tree to come down to this. Because not only does it provide that melee override and a dash, it also provides a raw 100% melee damage bonus, which is always active. But along with that straight melee damage bonus, the override also deals bonus damage, but this is a little bit more complicated. If you want a more in-depth look at how this works exactly, I do talk about it in the damage formulas video, but in short, the override adds a multiplier of 1.83 times onto the base melee damage portion of the melee formula, meaning that it slots into the formula the same way that the Mayhem scaling does. So you would have the base melee damage times 1.8 free from Blitz, and then times 16 for the Mayhem scaling, and then that is the number that will get multiplied by all your other bonuses. The Blitz attack also deals damage of your attuned element and has a cooldown of 10 seconds but resets on kill, allowing you to chain it through enemies. The Blitz attack dash can also move you while in fight for your life, which can be huge for true melee builds if you don't always want to have to swap to a Blade Fury or a Phase Puncher to get up. Coming to our purple tree and starting with our skills, we start with Phase Flare, where Amara summons a large orb of energy that deals constant damage in an area surrounding itself but also deals impact damage when thrown towards an enemy. Both of these damage sources deal splash damage, skill damage, and elemental damage. Recasting your action skill will cause the orb to fly back towards Amara, and meleeing the orb will cause it to fly back out in front of her, able to home in on an enemy if targeted towards one. Every time Amara melees the orb, it will actually store damage based on her melee hit and deal increased damage based on that. The orb does actually have a limit to the amount of damage that it can hold though, and if you go over that limit, when it impacts, it will explode. Blow Up makes it so that the orb no longer has that area of damage surrounding itself. Instead, Amara's orb will grant nearby allies health regen. You can also melee the orb to send it to a downed ally, which will grant them a second wind. The orb itself does actually still do impact damage though to enemies, it just doesn't have that aura around it that deals damage. Shooting Star is practically identical to Phase Flare, however dealing less impact and less area damage, and instead constantly firing out elemental projectiles at the last enemy that Amara damaged. And finally for action skills, we have Light Fantastic, which again is similar to Phase Flare, however Amara can no longer melee the orb to send it to an enemy. Instead, the orb will automatically travel to whatever enemy Amara damages, though will stop at the first enemy hit, and will gain increased damage every time Amara kills an enemy. She can still recast her action skill, however, to bring the orb towards her. The element of this tree is cryo damage, and there is only one augment in Expedite, which provides bonus cooldown rate for each enemy that was killed by her action skill. Coming to our skills, we start with Trust in Yourself, which provides Amara reload speed, charge speed, and weapon swap speed whenever her shield is broken by an enemy. If it is instead broken by a melee attack, these effects are all doubled. This still does provide a lot of stats to Amara, but all are pretty much unnecessary for a vast majority of Amara builds, and is by far the worst tier 1 still in this tree. It's also reliant on enemy damage being what breaks your shield, meaning that it doesn't work with the Ass Break Anointment or any damage that comes from Amara herself, which kinda kills any possibility for interactions that could maybe make this a little bit more consistent, kinda just leaving it in a state where it's an inconsistent skill that is inconsistently giving you stats that you don't really need, and stats that you even have more consistent ways of getting in other skill trees. No Mistakes in Nature is just a solid source of melee damage, giving you up to 65% melee damage whenever you inflict a status effect, which with Amara happens quite often. A tier 1 skill providing 65% melee damage for pretty much free is definitely hard to argue with for any melee focused build. Similarly, Heavy Rain is pretty much the No Mistakes in Nature for non-melee builds. This is just a solid source of splash damage for absolutely free. The projectile speed is also really nice, but worth keeping in mind that for guns that have a specific projectile pattern like the Devil's Foursome, Lyuda, Unkempt Herald, etc., this will extend their firing pattern, making guns that have sweet spots like the Lyuda or the Herald a little bit more difficult to use. Go With the Flow provides gun damage and movement speed whenever Amara freezes an enemy. This is a pretty good source of gun damage with a little bit of extra movement speed on top for doing something that Amara is pretty good at doing when built for. It is a shame that the move speed in this tree is locked to this skill though, as move speed is a very good stat for melee builds, but I mean gun damage would be a waste in this case. But gun damage is very good for Unweave the Rainbow, which deals bonus damage of Amara's attuned element whenever she deals melee damage or splash damage to frozen enemies. This is 11% of the damage dealt per point up to 33%. And this right here is genuinely one of Amara's strongest skills and is quite literally her version of Fire in the Stag Den, since this skill gets Mayhem scaling. But it's a little bit more complicated than what it says on the card. Against a frozen enemy, dealing melee damage or splash damage will proc UTR and deal additional skill damage of her attuned element. The percentage that this damage scales on excludes a vast majority of damage bonuses, only scaling from the base card damage of the gun and weapon damage bonuses for splash damage weapons and base melee damage, bonus raw melee damage, melee mayhem scaling, and the 300% bonus melee gets versus frozen targets for melee hits. The actual Unweave the Rainbow damage after being calculated will then receive applicable elemental and action skill damage bonuses. I will be going over the skill in even more depth in a later video, so so if you are interested in that, definitely stick around. In short though, this still is really strong on builds that exist to abuse it, and just pretty alright on a majority of other builds. Because for Unweave the Rainbow focused done builds, you do want to focus heavily into stacking weapon damage, and for melee builds you want to focus heavily into just stacking as much melee damage as you can. It is actually harder for Amara to stack raw melee damage than it is for her to stack raw weapon damage though, so Unweave the Rainbow ends up being a little bit worse for melee damage builds overall. But for just 3 points, you will often end up picking this up for a melee build anyways. Ebb and Flow is a really strong still for sustain, providing 21% lifesteal per point up to 63% whenever you kill an enemy with a melee attack. This is an incredibly good still because sustain is something that a lot of melee builds sorely lack. You really only need 1 point in here though for endgame, since not only is 21% just an insane amount as is for lifesteal, but you also deal so much damage on Mayhem 10, you'll pretty much be guaranteed to go from 0 to full health with a single melee kill. Combo Breaker provides a 20% chance to reset your action still whenever you kill an enemy with melee damage. This is a really solid still for keeping your action still tempo up for melee builds, as often melee builds don't have a lot of access to action still uptime, but do rely on action still usage for keeping many things active. This is a fantastic still to do just that for only a single point. Joyful Freedom provides Amara up to 70% melee damage after activating her action still. This alone is very good, however, it is also another example of a still not providing the whole story on the card, because this is another effect that actually stacks and is unlimited. For many melee focused builds, this can be difficult to fully abuse as a lot don't go very far into Blue Tree. However, if you get lucky enough with Combo Breaker and get a lot of resets within that 12 seconds, you can hit a lot of value from this. Although that is inconsistent, again, just getting that 70% melee damage is still very strong, but having this still have the potential to hit even higher melee damages, stacking 70% infinitely, just makes it even better. Burn Both Ends is a bit of a weird one, providing Amara increased threat after activating her action still. This draws the aggro of all enemies within a huge radius. This still also provides stacking damage whenever Amara is dealt damage by an enemy. This stacks up to 15 times for a max of 75% bonus damage. But this damage also functions a little weird. This is elemental damage, meaning it slots into your formula with your other elemental damage boosts, but it will also still be applied even to your non-elemental damage. So simply, it is additive with your elemental damage, multiplicative with everything else, and always applied while active. Body and Mind is a kill still which allows Amara's melee hits to deal bonus splash damage. This is really good for melee builds as it allows melee hits to not only benefit from splash damage bonuses, but also benefit from action still damage and a further times 31 Mayhem scale to Body and Mind damage. Body and Mind damage, however, is its own source of damage. As you can see on the card, it does have its own base damage on that splash damage, being 5,347, and that is the number that's actually getting Mayhem staled and getting your splash damage and action still bonuses. Pretty much what this means is Body and Mind is going to hit for the same damage no matter what the base damage of your actual melee hit is. It also activates on Blade Fury and Face Puncher shots, being especially potent on the Face Puncher due to activating for every pellet hit. Though along with that, using Infusion with the Face Puncher and Body and Mind will actually double the amount of Body and Mind procs that you get from it. Free the Soul is a kill still, which only activates whenever Amara kills a frozen enemy, which will cause splinters of ice to fly out from that enemy, homing in on nearby enemies to deal cryo area skill damage. Now, not only is Free the Soul very good for utility, as I do find that this freezes enemies on its own quite a bit, but because this is dealing splash damage, cryo damage, and still damage, and of course because of that getting Mayhem scaling, Free the Soul can hit for a fuck ton of damage. You can honestly kind of think of Free the Soul as a mini Remnant Orb. It's not going to be hitting for nearly as much as Remnant can, but this will still hit quite hard as it does scale off of a lot of different damages, all of which Amara often has a lot of. Atman is super simple, just raw still damage up to 27% for 3 points. Amara has a lot of things in her tree that scale off of still damage, and just many builds that want a lot of still damage. This is a really good still in some specific situations, very good if you need a place to just dump a few more points, otherwise not super necessary for a lot of builds. But anything more action still focused, this is very strong for. And finally onto the capstone, Clear the Mind, being a kill still which allows Amara to ignore enemies' elemental damage resistance. However, this does not affect elemental immunities. This is just a very stupid still, allowing you to use whatever fucking elements you want without having to worry about element matching, and it also has the funny side side effect of allowing you to freeze some things that you otherwise shouldn't be able to, like Wotan. This is a very strong still, pretty much only held back by the fact that it's this deep into Purple Tree, so it does end up being kind of niche, but in any build that is able to use it, it is an incredibly potent still. But that's gonna about do it for this one. I hope you guys enjoyed and maybe even learned something here. However, if you do still have any other questions, or just need more clarification on something, feel free to leave a comment down below, and maybe also consider leaving a like and subscribing so that you don't miss the next parts of this series. Also down in the description is a link to my Twitch channel where I'll be live right after this video goes up, and just below that is a link to my Discord server where you can come and join and hang out and ask me any questions you may have more directly. But with that all being said, I hope to see you guys in the next one.